The night the struggling widower found the woman sleeping in his barn was colder than any winter Elias Turner could remember, not because of the snow crusting the fields of his failing farm, but because loneliness had settled so deeply into his bones that even the crackling stove inside his house could not warm him. 3 years had passed since his wife Mary was buried beneath the old oak tree overlooking the pasture. And in those years, Elias had learned to live quietly, painfully, with grief as his only companion. His days were spent mending broken fences, nursing sick cattle, and counting debts that grew heavier than the sacks of grain he could no longer afford to buy. The mail-order bride advertisement he had placed months earlier had been an act of desperation more than hope, a last attempt to bring warmth back into a life that had gone cold. He had nearly forgotten about it when, on that late night, his horse began to whinny anxiously. Lantern in hand, Elias trudged to the barn, expecting a fox or stray animal, but instead found a woman curled in the hay, her coat thin, her hair dark and tangled, her breath shallow from exhaustion. She startled awake when the light fell on her face, fear flashing in her wide eyes, and in broken words explained she had arrived by train at the wrong station, had nowhere to go, and had followed the faint glow of his farm through the snow. When she whispered his name, spoken with an accent that carried sorrow and courage together, Elias realized with a shock that this was the woman from the letters, the mail-order bride who had crossed an ocean with nothing but faith and a promise. Her name was Anya. She had expected a house, a husband waiting, a future already begun. Instead, she had found a dark farm and a stranger's barn. Shame burned through Elias, but so did something else, an instinctive need to protect. He gave her his coat, helped her stand, and guided her inside the house, where she warmed her hands by the fire and fell asleep. At the table before he could even offer her food, watching her sleep, face soft and vulnerable in the flickering light, Elias felt the first stirrings of hope he had allowed himself in years, unaware that before the sun rose, his life would change forever. Morning came quietly, but Elias did not sleep. He sat through the night across from Anya, wrestling with fear, duty, and the weight of a promise he had never truly believed would be fulfilled. When dawn finally painted the frost-covered windows pale gold, Anya awoke confused and frightened, apologizing repeatedly for the trouble she believed she had caused. Elias listened as she told her story of poverty in her homeland, of a family she could no longer feed, of the letter that had offered her a chance at survival, not romance. She did not ask for love, only safety and honesty, and those words struck Elias deeper than any plea for affection could have. He admitted his situation plainly. The farm was struggling. Money was scarce, and grief still lived with him like a second shadow. Yet he also spoke the truth he had avoided admitting even to himself, that he needed someone, not only to help him survive, but to remind him how to live. In a moment born of urgency, rather than tradition, Elias proposed marriage there at the kitchen table, explaining that as his wife she would have shelter, a name, and protection from the harsh judgment reserved for lone women in unfamiliar lands. Anya hesitated, fear and determination warring within her, then nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks, not of joy but of relief. Before the sun fully rose, they rode into town. The preacher summoned from his bed. Witnesses gathered in half-sleeping confusion, and vows exchanged with trembling hands. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration, only the weight of two lives binding together out of necessity. When they returned to the farm as husband and wife, the silence between them was thick, uncertain but not empty. Elias showed Anya the small room that would be hers, insisting she take time to rest, while he went back to work with a strange lightness in his chest. Though their marriage had begun without love, both carried unspoken hope that perhaps kindness could grow into something deeper. Even in the most barren soil, life together unfolded slowly, awkwardly yet steadily, like spring pushing through frozen ground. Anya worked tirelessly, learning the rhythms of the farm. Baking bread that filled the house with warmth Elias had forgotten it could hold. tending the garden with a devotion born from years of hunger. She spoke little of her past, but Elias noticed the way she flinched at raised voices, how she carefully saved every scrap of food, how gratitude lived in her eyes even during the hardest days. In return, Elias found himself speaking to her in ways he had not spoken to anyone since Mary's death, sharing memories, regrets, and quiet dreams he had buried beneath responsibility. The townspeople were skeptical, their whispers sharp and unkind, but Anya endured them with grace, standing beside Elias at church, at market, at every public moment where judgment lingered. One night, during a violent storm that threatened to tear the barn apart, Elias found Anya shaking with fear, memories of loss resurfacing. He held her then, not as an obligation, not as a stranger, but as a man who understood grief, and in that embrace something shifted. Their marriage, once defined by necessity, began to soften into trust. Laughter returned to the house in small doses, followed by long conversations by the fire, and eventually hesitant touches that carried warmth rather than obligation. The farm slowly began to recover as well. Neighbors offered help. Crops improved and hope, fragile but real, took root. Elias realized he was no longer merely surviving. He was building something new, something shared. By the time the first anniversary of their dawn wedding arrived, Elias no longer recognized the hollow man he had been the night he found Anya in his barn. The farm thrived, not because fortune had suddenly smiled upon it, but because two wounded souls had chosen to work, endure, and believe together. Anya had transformed the house into a home filled with warmth, while Elias had learned to let go of the past without forgetting it. On that morning, as sunlight poured over the fields and birdsong replaced the silence that once haunted the land, Elias took Anya back to the barn where they had first met. There, among the golden hay and wooden beams, he confessed that he had married her out of fear and desperation, but loved her now with certainty and gratitude. Anya wept as she admitted she had arrived seeking survival, never imagining she would find belonging. They renewed their vows quietly, not for legality, but for the truth of their hearts, sealing a marriage that had grown from necessity into devotion. What began as a chance encounter on a freezing night became a testament to resilience, kindness, and the unexpected ways love can be born, not in grand ceremonies, but in quiet acts of mercy before dawn.